12. Black artists who died from HIV/AIDS complications. Stories of loss and stigma. What if I told you that some of the most powerful black voices in music, film, and dance weren't taken only by a virus, but by the silence around it? In the 80s and 90s, HIV/AIDS swept through the black creative world like a storm, and too often, the truth was buried under fear, gossip, and shame. Today, on Legends of Black Excellence, we're naming the names, honoring the art, and refusing fake news. Stay with me to the end because one story, Eazy-E's, will change how you remember that era. If you value truth over rumors, hit subscribe now. Eazy-E. In the early 1990s, HIV/AIDS was still widely framed as someone else's problem, something distant from mainstream America and, in many people's minds, distant from straight black communities. That illusion shattered when Eazy-E Eric Wright, the Compton entrepreneur who helped launch NWA and a whole era of West Coast rap, suddenly became the face of the epidemic. His story sits at the center of 12 black artists who died from HIV/AIDS complications, because it shows how brutally fast AIDS could strike in that era, and how stigma kept the truth underground until the very end. Eazy-E was admitted to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center on February 24, 1995, with a severe cough and breathing problems. Doctors diagnosed him with HIV/AIDS soon after. On March 16, 1995, he released a public statement confirming he had AIDS, explaining that he wanted to stop rumors and warn his fans about what was real. Just 10 days later, on March 26, 1995, he died from AIDS-related pneumonia at age 30. Some reports said 31 because his birth year had been misstated earlier in his career. The timeline was so short that it stunned even those closest to him, and it revealed a frightening medical truth of that period. Many people learned they were HIV positive only when they were already critically ill. What made his death historic wasn't only the loss of a star, it was the cultural shockwave. Hip-hop had rarely talked about HIV. Many fans believed AIDS was confined to other groups. Eazy-E's announcement forced a new conversation among heterosexual black men, precisely the audience that public health leaders were struggling to reach. Within weeks, artists and industry figures began organizing awareness and fundraising efforts like the Urban AD Benefit Movement, explicitly linking his passing to prevention and education. His final message became a warning wrapped in grief. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. Eazy-E's story also mirrors what other black artists in this list endured talent-meeting illness in a world that preferred silence. Some, like Arthur Ashe, were pushed into the spotlight by circumstance and used it to educate. Others died quietly, their diagnoses hidden by fear of shame. Eazy-E did not live long enough to see modern HIV treatment transform survival, but his disclosure helped crack the stigma that was killing people twice, once in the body and again in public judgment. Remembering him is more than nostalgia. It is a reminder that truth spoken out loud can save lives. Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe's story is one of greatness, grace, and a rare kind of courage that came after he had already changed tennis forever. Long before illness entered his life, Ashe was history in motion. The first black man to win singles titles at the US Open, 1968, the Australian Open 1970, and Wimbledon 1975. In a sport that had often kept black athletes at the margins, he didn't just compete, he conquered with a calm intelligence and dignity that made him a global symbol of possibility. Then came a twist no champion trains for. In 1983, Ashe underwent heart bypass surgery and received blood transfusions. Years later, doctors concluded he was likely infected with HIV through those transfusions before the blood supply was routinely screened. He learned he was HIV positive after developing toxoplasmosis, an opportunistic infection associated with AIDS. For several years, he kept the diagnosis private, largely to protect his young daughter and his family from the brutal stigma that still surrounded HIV in the late 1980s and early 1990s. That privacy ended in April 1992 when journalists began preparing to reveal his condition. Ash chose to speak first. On April 8, 1992, he publicly announced that he had contracted HIV from a transfusion. He admitted he was angry that his hand was forced, but also relieved to stop living in hiding. What followed was extraordinary. Instead of retreating, he stepped forward into the storm. He founded the Arthur Ashe Foundation for the Defeat of AIDS, advocated for research funding and better public education, and spoke directly to myths that said HIV only belonged to certain communities. He also launched the Arthur Ashe Institute for Urban Health, widening his work to address health inequality in Black and urban neighborhoods. Arthur Ashe died on February 6, 1993, at age 49 from AIDS-related pneumonia. The world mourned a sports legend, but his final year left a second legacy just as powerful. He helped reshape America's understanding of HIV. Ashe showed that stigma could be as deadly as disease, and that truth spoken with dignity could save lives. In the larger story of Black icons lost to HIV/AIDS, he stands not only as someone taken too soon, but as one of the epidemic's most important educators, turning private pain into public purpose. Fela Kuti. Fela Anikulapo Kuti's life reads like a thunderstorm, loud, electrifying, and impossible to ignore. To millions, he wasn't just a musician. He was the inventor of Afrobeat, a fearless critic of corruption in Nigeria, and a cultural revolutionary who used rhythm as a weapon. On stage, Fela could stretch a song for 20 minutes, building it into a protest. Off stage, he lived with the same intensity, uncompromising, controversial, and devoted to the idea that art must tell the truth. By the 1990s, however, that storm was meeting its limit. Fela's health declined visibly, and rumors followed him everywhere. In a society where HIV/AIDS was often surrounded by fear and moral judgment, speculation became a form of punishment. What is important, especially if we say no to fake news, is this Fela himself did not publicly confirm an HIV diagnosis while alive. But after his death on August 2, 1997, his family and his physician brother Olekoye Ransom Kuti stated that he died from complications related to AIDS. That public acknowledgement mattered. It cut through the haze of rumor and forced a conversation Nigeria had long tried to avoid. Fela's passing wasn't only the loss of an artist, it was the loss of a movement's heartbeat. At 58, he left behind dozens of albums, a new musical language, and generations of followers who still chant his lyrics like slogans. Yet the way the world reacted to his illness revealed something darker. When HIV entered the story, many people focused less on compassion and more on scandal. Even in death, Stigma tried to shrink him into gossip instead of legacy. Remembering Fela Kuti within the broader history of Black icons lost to HIV/AIDS is not about reducing him to a diagnosis. It's about seeing the full human picture: genius, struggle, vulnerability, and the brutal climate of shame that surrounded HIV in that era. Fela fought governments with music. In the end, his story also fights another enemy: silence. And that may be one of his most enduring acts of rebellion. Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey's life is a reminder that sometimes the quietest people leave the loudest legacies. Born in rural Texas in 1931 and raised during segregation, Ailey didn't come from privilege or a world that expected greatness from a Black boy who loved dance. Yet he carried something stubborn inside him, an ability to turn pain, memory, and hope into movement. When he moved to Los Angeles and later to New York, he found his language on stage, and that language would change American dance forever. In 1958, he founded the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, creating a home for Black dancers at a time when major companies rarely opened their doors to them. Ailey wasn't interested in dance that felt distant from real life. He wanted work that sounded like the Black church, looked like the blues, and moved like survival. In 1960, he premiered Revelations, a masterpiece built from spirituals and gospel, and it became one of the most performed modern dance works in the world. For millions of people, especially black audiences who had never seen their inner world honored in ballet or modern dance. Ailey's choreography felt like recognition. It said, "Your story belongs on the biggest stage." But behind the brilliance was a private struggle. By the late 1980s, Alvin Ailey's health declined. He was living in the shadow of HIV/AIDS at a time when the disease was still brutally stigmatized. Ailey died on December 1, 1989 at age 58 from an AIDS-related illness. Yet even in death, he tried to protect the people he loved from shame. He asked that the public be told he died of a blood disorder, fearing how the truth might hurt his mother and how cruel the world could be. That choice wasn't about dishonesty, it was about survival in a society that treated HIV like a moral verdict instead of a medical reality. Today, Alvin Ailey's name stands for far more than how he died. He left behind a company that still tours globally, a style that fused modern dance with black cultural memory, and a doorway for generations of artists who no longer have to beg for space. His story belongs in any honest conversation about black icons lost to HIV/AIDS because it shows the double weight they carried fighting illness in the body and stigma in the world. And still, Ailey gave us beauty that outlived both. Gil Scott-Heron. Gil Scott-Heron's story is the kind that reminds you how a voice can outlive a body. To many Americans, especially across black communities, he wasn't just a musician, he was a witness. In the 1970s and 80s, his spoken word jazz-soul hybrids captured the pressure of urban life and political betrayal with a sharpness that later shaped conscious hip-hop. Songs like "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised" didn't simply entertain. They challenged people to look at the world as it was, not as it was sold. But behind that fearless public voice, his later life was marked by struggle. Scott-Heron battled addiction for decades and went in and out of prison in the 2000s. During that period, he disclosed something that had been circulating only as rumor in a 2008 interview. He confirmed he had been HIV positive for several years and mentioned being hospitalized for pneumonia, an illness that can be especially dangerous for people with weakened immune systems. This confirmation matters because it lets us speak about his health truthfully without guessing or embellishing. At the same time, it's important to say no to fake news. There has never been an official public medical statement confirming that Gil Scott-Heron died from AIDS-related complications. Reputable outlets reported that he fell ill after returning from a European trip and died in New York City on May 27, 2011 at age 62. But the exact cause of death was not publicly released. So the honest way to frame his story within the HIV/AIDS era is he lived with HIV and he died after a period of serious illness, but we do not claim a cause that the record doesn't confirm. Why does he belong in a conversation about loss and stigma? Because his life shows how HIV in that generation often traveled with silence and shame. Even when an artist told the truth, the world still tried to reduce them to rumor or moral judgment. Scott-Heron refused that reduction. His final comeback album, I'm New Here 2010, sounded like a man bruised by life, but still reaching for meaning. And that's his legacy, not just the music, not just the diagnosis, but a human being who kept telling the truth until the truth itself became the art. Sylvester. Sylvester James Jr., known simply as Sylvester, was a rare kind of star, flamboyant without apology, tender without weakness, and fiercely himself, in an era that punished people for exactly that. Born in 1947 in Watts, Los Angeles, he grew up singing gospel in church, where his soaring falsetto first turned heads. But Sylvester's real stage was bigger than any choir loft. By the 1970s, he had become a shining force in the San Francisco music scene, blending soul, funk, and the rising pulse of disco into something ecstatic and personal. His breakthrough came with the 1978 smash, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real. The song wasn't just a dance floor anthem, it was liberation set to a beat. At a time when the country was arguing about gay rights, and many black artists were boxed into acceptable images, Sylvester performed in glitter heels and high glamour. He was openly gay, gender non-conforming, and unapologetically joyful. For many fans, especially queer Black audiences, he was proof that you could be loved without shrinking yourself. His concerts felt like safe houses, places where people could breathe, celebrate, and exist loudly. But the joy of those years collided with the darkest wave of the AIDS epidemic. In the mid-1980s, Sylvester was diagnosed with HIV. Like many artists of that generation, he faced not only the illness, but the fear and stigma wrapped around it. Yet he didn't retreat. He continued performing, recording, and surrounding himself with community. Friends described him as courageous and spirited, even as his health declined. Sylvester died on December 16, 1988, at the age of 40 from complications related to AIDS. His passing was a gut punch to the music world, and especially to San Francisco, where he had become a symbol of freedom and chosen family. Sylvester's story fits the theme of loss and stigma because it shows both what the epidemic stole and what it could never erase. AIDS took his life too early, but it didn't take his impact. Every time a new generation discovers disco, Vogue house, or any music that celebrates identity without shame, Sylvester is there echoing through the bass line, reminding us that being mighty real is its own kind of revolution. Howard Rollins. Howard Rollins' story is one of blazing talent, complicated battles, and a final chapter shaped by the harsh realities of the AIDS era. Born in 1950 in Baltimore, Rollins came up through theater with a presence that felt immediate and electric. He wasn't the kind of actor who simply played a role, he became it. That intensity carried him to Broadway and then to film, where he broke through in the early 1980s as one of the most gifted Black actors of his generation. Audiences first saw his full power in Ragtime 1981, a performance that earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. Not long after he starred in A Soldier's Story 1984, another critically acclaimed role that showed his range, quietly vulnerable one moment, fiercely commanding the next. Then came television, and in the heat of the night, Rollins played Virgil Tibbs, a sharp, principled detective who became a symbol of dignity and Black excellence for millions of viewers. For many Americans, he wasn't just acting, he was reshaping what a Black leading man could look like on primetime TV. But behind the spotlight, Rollins was struggling. He dealt with addictions and legal troubles that derailed his career just as it was hitting full stride. In an industry that already offered Black actors fewer second chances, those issues took an especially steep toll. By the mid-1990s, his health was failing. Rollins was diagnosed with AIDS, and the illness advanced rapidly. He died on December 8, 1996, at only 46 years old from complications linked to AIDS-related lymphoma. In that period, even as medical science was beginning to turn a corner, many people, especially in marginalized communities, were still reaching care too late, often because stigma and fear kept them silent. Howard Rollins belongs in this conversation, not because his death defines him, but because it reveals the double burden Black artists carried during the epidemic, fighting a life-threatening disease while living in a culture that treated HIV as shameful. What remains is the work performances that still feel alive, still feel urgent. His legacy is a reminder that brilliance can be fragile and that compassion matters as much as remembrance. Willie Ninja. Willie Ninja's story is one of invention, survival, and quiet genius, because before the world knew what voguing was, he was already turning it into art. Born William Leake in 1961, he grew up in New York City and found his real home in the underground ballroom scene of Harlem. For queer Black and Latino communities shut out of mainstream stages, ballroom wasn't just nightlife. It was family protection and a place to be seen. And inside that world, Willie didn't just participate. He led. He rose to fame as the godfather of Vogue, shaping the sharp angles, fluid lines, and dramatic poses that later became a global language. In the 1980s, his style was so precise, so cinematic, that dancers from other houses studied him like scripture. When the documentary Paris is Burning 1990 introduced ballroom culture to wider audiences, Willie became its most recognizable face, calm, elegant, and iconic. What people saw on screen was beauty. What they didn't always see was the discipline behind it. Willie studied martial arts and fashion runway technique, building voguing into something both street-born and high art. He later worked as a model and choreographer, training supermodels and bringing ballroom attitude into mainstream fashion long before the industry gave credit. But like many black queer artists of his generation, Willie lived through the worst years of the AIDS epidemic. HIV moved through ballroom houses with devastating speed, and the stigma around it was brutal. People died young, often without public recognition, and the outside world rarely understood the grief inside those chosen families. Willie was diagnosed with HIV, and over time, his health weakened. He died on September 2, 2006, at the age of 45 from AIDS-related complications, including heart failure. His passing was a deep wound to ballroom culture, not just because of his fame, but because he represented possibility, a black gay man who turned a hidden world into a lasting legacy. Today, you can see Willie Ninja everywhere, even if people don't always know his name. Every time you see Vogue in music videos, fashion shows, or pop performances, you're watching his blueprint. His life fits the theme of loss and stigma because he was a pioneer who helped the world celebrate a culture it once ignored, yet he still faced an epidemic that thrived on silence. Willie didn't just dance to escape reality, he danced to rewrite it. And that rewrite is still happening. Jean Anthony Ray. Jean Anthony Ray's life is a vivid reminder of how quickly brilliance can rise and how brutally an epidemic and stigma could cut it short. Born in Harlem on May 24, 1962, Ray wasn't trained in the polished, traditional way many dancers were. What he had instead was raw fire, the kind you can't teach. That energy landed him the role of Leroy Johnson in the 1980 film Fame, and later in the long-running TV series. For audiences, Leroy was unforgettable, bold, restless, magnetic, and Jean brought that character to life because in many ways, he was that spirit. But when the spotlight dimmed, Ray struggled hard. He battled addiction, instability, and long stretches of life far from the glamour people associated with fame. In 1996, he was diagnosed HIV positive. In that era, an HIV diagnosis wasn't just medical news, it carried a crushing social weight. For many black artists, especially those whose careers were already fragile, the stigma could isolate them from work community and even basic support. Ray kept going anyway, teaching dance performing when he could, and trying to rebuild his life in pieces. In June 2003, Jean suffered a major stroke that left him severely weakened. His health never recovered. He died on November 14, 2003, at just 41 years old from complications of that stroke, with AIDS-related illness contributing to his decline. It's important to be clear here. Credible reports do not say he died suddenly of AIDS in the 1990s, as some internet rumors have claimed. The verified record shows a long struggle with HIV, followed by a stroke and a final medical collapse in 2003. Jean Anthony Ray belongs in any honest story about black artists lost to HIV/AIDS because his life shows the epidemic's double cruelty, first the disease itself, then the shame that hovered around it. Yet his legacy didn't vanish with his body. Every time Fame plays and Leroy jumps across that stage like the world is his, Jean is still there, reminding us that talent is human, vulnerable, and precious, and that stigma should never get the last word. Jermaine Stewart. Jermaine Stewart's story feels almost poetic in hindsight because the song most people remember him for was already warning a generation about the moment that would later take him. Born William Jermaine Stewart on September 7, 1957 in Columbus, Ohio, he grew up with dance in his bones. As a teenager, he moved to Chicago, and by the late 1970s, he was on Soul Train first as a dancer, then as a performer whose charisma stood out even in a room full of stars. That dance talent carried him on tour with Shalimar and later into the orbit of Culture Club, where he worked with Boy George connections that helped shape his stylish, high-energy blend of R&B, pop, and dance. His breakthrough came in 1986 with "We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off," a top 5 Billboard hit that became a global anthem. But what made the song special wasn't only the catchy hook, it was the message. Stewart framed intimacy around self-respect and safer choices right as America was entering a moral panic about AIDS. Years later, that song would read like a time capsule from an era when people were scared, misinformed, and desperate for clear human language about sex and safety. He followed with other successful singles like "Say It Again" and "Get Lucky," and for a while it looked like he'd be a permanent fixture on the charts. Behind the scenes, though, the late 80s and early 90s were harder. His mainstream visibility faded, and like many artists of that time, especially queer black performers working inside a culture of judgment, he faced heavy pressure to stay private about his personal life. Reliable sources confirm that Stewart was living with HIV, and his health deteriorated through the 1990s. What matters for no fake news is the verified record. Jermaine Stewart died on March 17, 1997, in Homewood, Illinois, at age 39, from AIDS-related liver cancer. Jermaine Stewart belongs in any honest conversation about black artists lost to HIV/AIDS, because his life shows the epidemic's double cruelty, the illness itself, and the stigma that tried to shrink a person into rumor. Yet his legacy refuses to shrink. Every time that bright, gentle chorus plays, reminding people they don't have to risk everything to feel loved. Jermaine is still teaching, still protecting, still dancing in the memory of a world that needed him longer than it got. Max Robinson. Max Robinson's life sits at a powerful crossroads in American history where black excellence television journalism and the AIDS era all collided. Born in Richmond, Virginia in 1939, Robinson climbed into a profession that was overwhelmingly white and often openly hostile to black ambition. Early in his career, he reportedly had to read the news from behind a screen so viewers wouldn't know he was black, an indignity that says everything about the world he was fighting to change. He pushed forward anyway, becoming one of the most respected local anchors in Washington, D.C., and then breaking the ultimate barrier in 1978. That year, Max Robinson became the first black man to co-anchor a nightly network news broadcast when ABC placed him alongside Peter Jennings and Frank Reynolds on World News Tonight. For millions of black viewers, especially older Americans who had waited their whole lives to see someone like them behind that desk, it was a seismic moment. Robinson wasn't just reading headlines. He was rewriting what America thought authority looked like. He later helped co-found the National Association of Black Journalists, NABJ, mentoring younger reporters and widening the pipeline for a generation that followed. But the price of being first can be crushing. Behind the camera, Robinson wrestled with heavy personal struggles, including alcoholism and the emotional toll of constant pressure in a racist industry. In 1988, at a time when HIV/AIDS was still widely feared and deeply stigmatized, he was diagnosed with AIDS. He kept his illness private like many public figures of that era, knowing how quickly society turned sickness into shame. On December 20th, 1988, Max Robinson died in Washington, D.C. at age 49 from complications of AIDS. The news hit hard not only because he was a pioneer, but because his death revealed how close the epidemic was to homes, churches, and communities that America had been taught to believe were not affected. Max Robinson belongs in any honest account of black icons lost to HIV/AIDS because his story shows the epidemic's double wound, the body fighting disease and the soul fighting stigma. He opened doors in life, and in his passing, he opened eyes. His legacy is still alive every time a black journalist sits at a national anchor desk without having to hide behind a screen. Franklin Seals. Franklin Seals is one of those gifted television actors from the 1980s whose name deserves to be remembered more widely. He was born on July 15, 1952 in Caliacqua, St. Vincent in the Caribbean, and later came to the United States to study acting. He trained seriously and graduated from Juilliard, which was, and still is, one of the most elite performing arts schools in America. That foundation gave him a quiet precision on screen. He could be funny without forcing it, and dramatic without ever slipping into cliché. American audiences knew Seals best as Dexter Stuffins on the sitcom Silver Spoons. Dexter wasn't a throwaway side character. He was the sharp, no-nonsense manager who often stole scenes with dry humor and impeccable timing, grounding the show's wealthy fantasy world in something more human and believable. Outside of sitcom work, Seals also built a solid film resume. Critics noticed him early for playing Jimmy Lee Youngblood Smith in The Onion Field 1979, a role that showed his intensity and emotional range. He went on to appear in films such as Southern Comfort 1981, and in well-known TV dramas, including Hill Street Blues, Amen, and Growing Pains. Even small appearances like a brief part in Star Trek: The Motion Picture proved that casting directors trusted him across genres. Behind a career that was still growing, however, Seals was facing a private battle that many public figures of that era felt forced to hide. Reliable historical records confirm that he died on May 14, 1990, in Brooklyn, New York, at only 37 years old from AIDS-related complications. He did not publicly disclose his condition while alive, an understandable choice in a period when HIV was wrapped in cruelty, fear, and moral judgment, especially toward Black artists. Franklin Seals's story fits the theme of loss and stigma. In the most heartbreaking way, a highly trained, charismatic performer with momentum and promise, taken at a time when medicine had few answers and society offered even less compassion. What survives is the work he left behind, warm, intelligent performances that still hold up, and a reminder that an entire generation of artists endured this epidemic in silence. Remembering Seals now is part of telling that history honestly, without rumor, and without forgetting the people it cost us. In the end, the stories of these artists remind us that HIV/AIDS did more than claim lives. It exposed the fault lines of stigma, fear, and silence in Black communities and in America itself. Their legacies challenge us to ask uncomfortable questions about whose suffering is remembered and whose is ignored. On Legends of Black Excellence, we honor their brilliance, but we also confront the truth. Talent shouldn't be erased by shame, and history shouldn't be shaped by silence. So as we close this chapter, the real debate begins. How do we ensure their stories spark understanding, not judgment, for generations to come?